Welcome to Industrial Engineering 537, Large-Scale Systems. The purpose of today's lecture is essentially to provide you a couple of good examples, some very good class projects we had in this class. It's timely for you to take a look at these in preparing your class project reports and PowerPoint slides and give you a sense for what we're looking for with this. But let me set this up again by describing more precisely what it is we're looking for in these class projects. First of all, as a reminder, the objective is the management of neo-Luddite radical behavior. You probably heard that more than enough in this semester. The approach has four different components to it. One is the classical systems engineering stages. That's where you spent a fair amount of the time in the first third of the class. The second is social movement theory. Again, we spent a fair amount of time with this, with subject matter expert coming in and describing what it is, and then building essentially a causal loop structure describing it. The third is reverse reductionism. We talked about that during the first segment, but the purpose would be to demonstrate how one uses reverse reductionism in these class projects. And the final one is federation of models and analysis, and federation here meaning not necessarily the models have to pass data explicitly from one to the other, but at least we're using the output of one as input to another. I will highlight one thing here, the last 2 points, the reverse reductionism and the federation of models / analysis. A year ago, in fact, last July of 2007, the National Science Foundation asked us to put together a collection of, we call them luminaries or subject matter experts in system of systems, complex systems thinking, and help the National Science Foundation understand what it is that was needed in university curricula across the country. Their intent was and still is to put in place a research and development agenda for the National Science Foundation in this emergent area of complex system of systems. The two principal things that came out of that colloquium that I had the good fortune to facilitate were, number one, it was a collective opinion of all the folks engaged that students needed to be taught how to think in a reverse reductionist mode. And that's in sharp contrast to the classical way people think about solving engineering problems, which is very much reductionism. And the second was there's a plethora of modeling and analysis tools out there, and there's not one silver bullet among those tools that will help solve these or model these complex systems. It's going to be essentially a portfolio of these tools. So the point with the second one, federation of models, was that we needed to put into the curriculum ways to instruct students in how to federate, or at least give them experience about using models and not necessarily having them talk directly with one another, but output from one feeding the input to the other. So that's the genesis of those last two bullets. And then the expected results from this is a portfolio of policy options that help solve the problems arising from neo-Luddite aversion to technological progress. Let me emphasize one thing. This is large-scale, complex system of systems that we're about here. Engineering is in there. What engineers are all about is bringing technology to people. And so we have to think at a very high level in this class when we're thinking about complex systems and impacting the quality of life for people through various technological options. That's why we're focused here at the highest level on policy options to help people solve problems technologically. And we're talking about technological progress, so there's a double-edged sword here on technology. Mentioned that in this class you've been given background instruction on 6 different modeling and analysis tools. We spent about a week on each one of the 6 here, a little bit more on the systems dynamics. So we got into SOSAT, intelligent agents, risk analysis, decision analysis, game theory, and system dynamics. And what's asked for in these class projects is we pick at least 2 of those and use them in a federated modeling sense to help us make decisions about policy portfolios. System dynamics is not required but strongly encouraged. And the other point is there are other people in the class, I'm sure, who know other tools, and that's fine. Use those if you wish, but they're not to be counted in the 2 here. So we had to pick 2 from these 6, minimum of 2. The deliverables for the class project, we have a report in Word articulating the results, a presentation in PowerPoint, providing a briefing of the project, and what you're going to be exposed to here in just about 5 minutes is essentially an overview of 2 of the better projects we had in our class. Again, that'll help guide your work in preparation of your class project. For the report itself, we're looking for a 12-point font throughout except for the cover and the outline. In the cover page, what's the title of the project, what's the class title, who are you, who's the author, and what's the date of the report. The executive summary, I'd like to keep that to half a page or less. We have an introduction that's going to be a full page, an approach, which is 2 pages. The bulk of the writing will be in the results section, 4 pages, and a commentary, which consists of a summary, conclusions, and recommendations, a final 2 pages. And then appendices, I say arbitrary or as appropriate here. Strongly encouraged to use figures and graphics throughout. And ideally, there'll be a connectivity between your Word file and your PowerPoint file. The presentation, 1 slide for the title, 1 slide for articulating the overview of the purpose and the results you got, a slide that describes the motivation or the background for the work, 1 slide describing your approach, 4 slides for results. Again, this is the meat of the work you did, and then the commentary, summary, conclusions, 1 slide, and then recommendations, 1 slide. This is a pretty standard fare for presentations, and I will emphasize that all these components are very important. You don't necessarily have to call them out this way, but it is important when you make presentations that you try to cover these topics. And let me emphasize that very last one in commentary, the recommendations, 1 slide. Quite often, if you want to continue to receive a paycheck, you're going to have to articulate what it is that you're going to do to follow this work up. So what are your recommendations for future work? So that's a very important slide. Don't forget that one. And as with the Word file, you're encouraged to make very liberal use of graphics throughout those 10 slides. Gave you an analytical framework, and in order to jumpstart your project, go back to the social movement theory influence diagram and the systemic characterization I gave you. I gave you a framework with policy categories and quality of life categories. Clearly, if we're going to influence Neo-Luddite, the social movement, we have to understand the notion of social movement and the effect of different policy options. And typical dimensions of quality of life, showing here: human health, human rights, economic well-being, environmental quality, cultural heritage preservation, availability of services, and confidence in government. And I'll emphasize yet again that in the exploration we've done with these quality of life dimensions, these tend to serve as a good, if you will, spanning vector space, or this space of quality of life. People, when they identify things related to their quality of life, will find something in each of these 6 categories, and usually not anything beyond those 6 categories. And those categories do indeed influence social movements. In the policy categories, I'm encouraging you to explore and include these different categories. 1 is regulations. 2nd is fiscal incentives, taxes, and subsidies. 3rd is information, education, and outreach. The 4th is technology development and deployment. Clearly, that has to be an integral part. Fifth is the intra-organizational relations, and the final is enforcement. So just as with the quality of life categories, the assertion here is if you have a policy, it will generally fit into one of these 6 categories, one of these 6 dimensions, so we don't leave something out here. And just a word from our friend Confucius. This comes from a parable that he told. One day his students and he passed a grave where they saw a woman weeping in a gravestone. She told Confucius that her husband's father, and her son were killed by a tiger. When Confucius asked her why she didn't leave such a fated spot, she answered that in this place there was no oppressive government. And then Confucius said, "Remember this, my child, an oppressive government is fiercer and more feared than a tiger." I point that out because what we're about in developing this policy portfolio in order to continually improve quality of life, it does indeed relate to what some people believe are oppressive acts by a government, things like regulations and so on. So you have to be very careful and thoughtful when you come up with these policy options to ensure we don't get into this world of what people perceive as oppressiveness. Social movement theory, as a reminder, had these 3 different dimensions: the resource mobilization, the opportunities, constraints, and the framing process. Actually showed an analytic framework then which has that social movement theory kernel that we're trying to influence. There are non-anthropogenically induced stresses. There are anthropogenically induced ones, which are, in our case, we had the improvised explosive devices that the Neo-Luddites were using. We have the policy categories that are trying to influence this social behavior, and then the quality of life dimension on the other side. So think of it as a control system where the controls are on the left side there, the policy categories, and the things we're trying to control too are on the right side over there, the human quality of life. And the thing we're controlling there in the middle is the social movement. And just as a reminder where this information is available to you, back in Lecture 2, we talked about reductionism and reverse reductionism. We talked about classical systems engineering in Lecture 3, modeling and analysis tools. That was largely in the second segment of the class. That was Lectures 11 through 22. Talking about these different elements of things we covered in detecting the command wire detonated IEDs. Obviously, the policy category there is technology development and deployment. Quality of life categories include human health and all the way through availability of services. And then maintaining that command wire detonated improvised explosive device detection system, that SOSAT example that you were given. Again, that's technology development and deployment, and it impacted those same quality of life categories. In the intelligent agents exam problem you had, policy category was primarily intra-organizational relations, and the quality of life categories were human rights and cultural heritage preservation. In the risk analysis, you were actually asked to identify policy options for managing or mitigating risks. And clearly the quality of life categories, all of them were cut across in that particular example. You were also asked to develop some specific metrics for that. In decision analysis, we had the challenge of determining the optimal strategy for developing policy portfolios for managing social movements. That was the smitten problem. And the policy categories will, by design, include all six of them. Quality of life, again, all of them, or include all 7. And the game theory, we had this covert arms race in the policy category, and principally technology development and deployment. And once again, it cut across all quality of life categories. This was the influence diagram. It's not an eye chart. You have this in your notes, and it's on the lecture, but essentially breaks down at the next level those 3 categories of social movement theory: the resource mobilization at the top, framing processes in the lower right, and opportunities constrained to the lower left, and the connections among those. Okay, so in this class project, we assume that the radical behavior employed by the Neo-Luddites to implement their social movement is less than desirable for the collective society. I'm pretty sure nobody would disagree with that statement. People were being killed and the transportation system disrupted. So the overall problem is to determine a policy portfolio that will result in outcomes that improve the overall quality of life of the collective society, including the Neo-Luddites. So that's the challenge. And specifically, your solution, should be portfolio policy options drawn from those 6 different categories that I provided during Lecture 22. The value of the solution should be characterized in the context of the quality of life categories that I provided during also Lecture 22. So that's your control system. You should use the social movement theory that we talked about in Lecture 8 and elsewhere as the engine, if you will, of this to ensure you've captured all the important aspects of the system. It's complex, it's large scale, it's adaptive, intelligence, and wicked. And then to explore your solution space, you should use at least 2 of the modeling tools that we covered in the second segment of the class. You should use both reductionism and reverse reductionism. And then finally, you should ensure that you have considered at least the early stages of the classical engineering paradigm. That's the conceptualization and the design stage largely. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first student. She's going to describe her class project, and I'll let her introduce herself when she comes up.
Hello, my name is Kim McGavran. I am a former student of Professor Enge's in ie537, and I'll be presenting my solution to the Neo-Luddite problem as he's defined it. The overview. The purpose you already understand as presented in the assignment. Bottom line up front for the results. We've identified an initial portfolio of policies to address the Neo-Luddite problem. And 4 key ways ahead. First of all, we have to probe the Neo-Luddite organization to determine how monolithic they are. Do they have a leader? What is their organization? How do we interact with them? Secondly, we need to research the likelihood that any pro-Neo-Luddite policies or programs and any social redress we undertake will be perceived as cooperating or rewarding terrorism. And we've got to determine how to address legitimate issues without creating that perception. We also need to research the likely Neo-Luddite response to implementation of the counter-IED system of systems. How are they going to react when that particular repertoire is denied? And then finally, we need to assess the cost of the policy portfolio in terms of cost to the taxpayer, determine the feasibility, the likelihood of success, and the payback for the various portfolio options. The background and the motivation, I'm sure you're familiar with by now. We're assuming that we are proceeding with development and implementation of the counter-IED system of systems, and that the portfolio policy options has to address the root cause of the violence and not just address one symptom of it. This was my approach, using classical systems engineering process and the social movement theory to define the problem and identify the possible solutions. And identifying and defining the problem, said we need to address the source of the Neo-Luddite violence such that their violent behavior is turned into a more constructive one. We need to develop and employ a portfolio of policy options that effectively address Neo-Luddite grievances and legitimate social ills to reduce their violent behavior for the benefit of society as a whole. And we need to identify the appropriate socioeconomic and technological context, which we will do with the social movement theory. And in designing a system solution, we've identified some policy options. To conduct the research to explore the concepts, I have used the risk analysis model and systems dynamics. And then to develop and test the model, again, using systems dynamics as well as the VinSim software. And in the social movement theory, going to identify the three key components: the framing process, the resource mobilization, opportunities and constraints, and then doing that within the 7 quality of life dimensions that Professor Enge's already defined for us. I realize the font is very small on this, so bear with me. I'm going to read the majority of it. In the portfolio of policy options, there was not a vast amount of background available on the neo-Luddite situation or the actual current socioeconomic situation, so a lot of this I have invented in order to help develop a portfolio of policy options. So if a lot of this situation seems new to you, this is the situation as I perceived it and understood it. The issues, using the categories again that were given to us. Human health. Believe that because of the neo-Luddite aversion to technology, they do not believe in modern medicine. They prefer their traditional holistic practices, and these practices are either not available or they are not covered by state or national insurance policies. There are private practices available to them, but most neo-Luddites cannot afford them. On the human rights side, the neo-Luddites feel that they have a right to live in a society that is technology-free. They resent the intrusion of radio, TV, cell phone towers, etc., and blame technology or evil electromagnetic waves for many ills and diseases. In terms of economic well-being, the neo-Luddites blame technology for the loss of jobs in many sectors. Unemployment locally among both neo-Luddites and non-neo-Luddites is at record highs. Many jobs have been outsourced to more technologically advanced nations, and local and agricultural textile products cannot compete against those of other regions. In terms of environmental quality, neo-Luddites blame technology for pollution of their traditional farmlands and water resources. For example, fallout from regional smelters increasing the levels of arsenic and lead in the groundwater and in the soil. For cultural heritage preservation, the neo-Luddites feel that their traditional way of life has been threatened by the increased introduction of technology into this region. Urbanization has removed or reduced the amount of land available for traditional farming, hunting, and fishing, and they feel surrounded and bombarded by the electronic media in their own neighborhoods. In terms of availability of services, many social services are now computer-based. Neo-Luddites reject the idea of being in a database, anything that's serviced by a computer. Increased reliance on electronic commerce and banking has reduced the availability of a lot of these services to the neo-Luddites. And in terms of confidence in government, neo-Luddites have been traditionally excluded from the political process. They have little confidence that a government will be responsive to their needs. There are also long-term and deep-seated prejudices between the Luddites, the neo-Luddites, and the mainstream society. Because of this, they have resorted to violence and their insistence on neo-Luddite rule. Now, in order to address some of these issues, because we cannot address all of them, have the following solutions, and these are just a product of initial brainstorming. In terms of fiscal incentives, could perhaps introduce tax incentives for businesses not outsourcing jobs to foreign countries or out of the region, and for those acquiring new methods or equipment to increase productivity and competitiveness of local goods. Now, obviously, introducing technology is not going to accomplish neo-Luddite goals, but if we can improve the condition of society, of mainstream society, we can target the framing process of the neo-Luddites and reduce the legitimacy of some of their arguments. For information, education, and outreach, job training to combat unemployment, again, among both neo-Luddites and non-neo-Luddites. Availability and coverage of traditional medicine within the national health care system. And establishing neo-Luddite outreach centers designed to provide social services to neo-Luddites in a non-technological manner. That's one avenue we can explore. For technology development and deployment, again, investing in new farm and factory technologies. Again, technology will not make the neo-Luddites happy, but we can perhaps improve the general social environment, reducing the legitimacy of some of their claims. And we can certainly invest in environmental cleanup technologies for soil and water and things to reduce future contamination and pollution of the environment, which is one of the neo-Luddites' key arguments. For inter- and intra-organizational relations, we could look at establishing a committee for neo-Luddite relations to introduce and integrate the neo-Luddites into the political process and to provide a constructive forum to address grievances and come to common cooperative solutions. In terms of enforcements, we're assuming that we are proceeding with the counter-IED system of systems to prevent the IED detonations and perhaps potentially catch neo-Luddites as they are emplacing them. And then we can look at tying neo-Luddite outreach programs to a reduction in violence on their part. The first analysis tool I chose to use was the risk analysis model. In doing that, brainstormed and came up with 4 potential scenarios that we could encounter. The first scenario, introduction of neo-Luddite or pro-neo-Luddite policies and programs might give the impression that the government is responsive to violent tactics, which could lead other groups, other dissident groups, to try to implement these methods in order to achieve their political goals. We could end up with a net increase in violence, not only from the neo-Luddites, but from other groups that we haven't heard from yet. And believe this is likely. The consequences, and then these are just sort of rough orders of magnitude, what we might be able to expect. Death or injury, an increase of perhaps 5 per month. Loss in government, loss of confidence in government, we could see as high as 50% in approval ratings as violence increases and spreads to other groups. The cost in dollars is assessed as the cost associated with the continued requirement for operation of the counter-IED system of systems. And techniques to mitigate that, again, it goes back to our framing process. How do we address legitimate social ills without creating the perception that we are rewarding terrorism? That's going to be key. The second scenario is the do-nothing scenario. Failure to address legitimate neo-Luddite concerns and society's issues increases the credibility of their framing process, leading to increased resource mobilization, both money and personnel, increased tolerance for their cause and their actions. I view that scenario as likely if we do not do anything to address the situation. Consequences, death and injury, we believe constant at 5 per month. Loss of confidence in government assessed as a 20% loss. More violence from the same group I don't believe to be as damaging as increased violence from more groups. And then the cost is that of continuing to operate the system of systems, as in scenario 1. The third situation is implementation of the counter-IED system of systems all by itself. The system is successful. However, the success in preventing the detonation of the IEDs leads the neo-Luddites to either emplace more IEDs than they were before, or it leads them to take up other violent tactics, different types of IEDs, other violent means. We believe that is likely if we don't do anything to address the root cause of the violence. Consequences, deaths and injury, it could be anywhere from a decrease of 5 as the system works to an increase of 5 as they either emplace more IEDs or find other violent methods. Loss of confidence in government could be as much as 10% as this very expensive system of systems that we've emplaced begins to lose effectiveness. Cost in dollars. As they resort to other tactics, we're going to have to come up with other systems to defeat those tactics. So, could be as much as the cost of the current system of system in development, but believe it to be somewhere on the order of tens of millions to continue to develop these systems to combat the violence. And the final scenario, scenario number 4, actually a better case scenario is that the policy portfolio succeeds in relieving the environmental and economic issues for the majority of the population, for the mainstream, and we succeed in discrediting the neo-Luddite claims and decreasing the legitimacy of their argument. This results in a small hardcore group of neo-Luddites that are even further marginalized from mainstream society and completely outside the process. Likelihood, it's possible. Death or injury, no increase. Probably no decrease as this small group of hardcore neo-Luddites is going to continue to push their agenda through violence. But perhaps an increase in the confidence in the government as the situation for the mainstream society improves generally. And we still have the cost associated with maintaining and operating the system of systems, as we still have that small group that is pursuing violence, although perhaps on a decreased scale. So those are the 4 situations. And I used the Systems Dynamics SMT kernel that you're probably familiar with already to take a look at these scenarios to see if the scenarios were validated by this model. And for scenarios 2 and 4, scenario 2 being the do-nothing scenario, you can take a look at the original SMT kernel as presented in class and see that those are the results that we can expect. Increased activism on the part of the Neo-Luddites, increased mobilization of resources among the population. And then for scenario number 4, which is the example that you see here, you'll see there are 2 places where the new portfolio enters the model. And I've highlighted in yellow just some of the key areas where you can expect to see changes. We change our state policies and practice, which is highlighted by the arrow to the right. And you'll see on the right there are some polarity changes in the signage of unemployment, economic development, public and social welfare programs, and repression of the citizenry. We've had polarity changes in all those signs. And what we should see from there is a decrease in ease of identifying and publicizing social problems. A decrease of legitimacy on the part of the Neo-Luddite argument. We should see decreased resonance of their argument among the population. Decreased likelihood that we'll have a rule by Neo-Luddite law. If you move to the left into opportunities and constraints, this new portfolio should reduce political, social, cultural, and economic problems. That reduction should lead as well. We have an increased formal access to policies, to political institutions and decision-making, hopefully through creation of this Neo-Luddite outreach centers and Committee for Neo-Luddite Relations. We increase their formal access to the process. Should increase their perception of opportunities, positive opportunities, constructive opportunities, and hope to see an increase in their rational decision-making, maximizing use of positive opportunities and minimizing adversity. And then moving up into resource mobilization, we should see a decrease in the public perception that the SMO provides value, more so than the state, an increase in the public perception that the state regime is of value to the people, an increase in state strength, and we also have an increase in SMO activism, but this should be the positive kind of activism and not the violence that we've seen so far. So use this model to validate scenarios 2 and 4. Unfortunately, scenarios 1 and 3, scenario 1 being where introduction of positive Neo-Luddite policies actually causes an increase in violence overall as other groups perceive that their tactics are being rewarded. And then scenario 3, let me go back for a second. Here we go. Scenario 3, where implementation of the system of system causes them to step up in placement of IEDs or revert to other forms of violence. Those actually fall outside the SMT kernel. Scenario number 1 is viewed as the most dangerous. And this is the one that we don't have a model to validate because don't really have a good understanding of how success of one SMO's repertoire can affect the behavior and activities of others. So that's something that ultimately we're going to have to look into to validate scenario 1. For scenario 3, wanted to take a look at the impact of implementing the system of systems, the counter IED system of systems, both with and without the policy portfolio, here referred to as the process. And the question is, what do the Neo-Luddites do once this repertoire is denied to them? If they're emplacing these IEDs, but they're not having the intended effect. To do that, I created just a very simple Venn-Sim model, really is just a point of departure for argument, to assess the impact of this. We start out at the top of the model with what I'm calling Neo-Luddite disgruntlement, which is assessed on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being they are perfectly contented, and 100% being as disgruntled and contentious as they can get. Neo-Luddite disgruntlement leads to number of IEDs in place. Started out with an assumption that they're currently capable of placing a maximum of 10 IEDs per month. And this is just for sake of argument. Started out with Neo-Luddite disgruntlement at 50%. So the number of IEDs they're emplacing is a function of the max times the percentage of the disgruntlement. So they're currently emplacing 5 IEDs a month. The number of IEDs that are emplaced feeds into the number of IEDs that are successful. But that is tempered by the effectiveness of the system of systems. And for sake of argument, we've assumed that the system of systems is 80% effective. Again, just a very simple model. So the number of IEDs they're emplacing is 5. The SOS effectiveness is at 80%. So right now, in the first iteration through the model, 4 of the IEDs are denied. 1 detonates as intended, based on 5 in place and an 80% effectiveness. That will lead to an IED shortfall. Currently, in the first iteration, they have an IED shortfall of 4. They emplaced 5, only 1 detonated. 4 didn't go off, so they have a shortfall in their intended goal of 5 IEDs. An increase in the IED shortfall leads to an increase in Neo-Luddite disgruntlement. They become more disgruntled as their objectives are not being achieved. And if you look at the graph on top is for number of IEDs emplaced, and that's emplaced, not successfully detonated. And then at the bottom, the graph for Neo-Luddite disgruntlement. And you can see there's a direct correlation. But the more IEDs we deny them, the more disgruntled they become, the more IEDs they emplace. And we end up in sort of a vicious cycle here. So we wanted to introduce the policy portfolio called Success of the Process. And success of the process is going to have what we hope is a positive impact on Neo-Luddite disgruntlement. The more positive the process is, the less disgruntled they become. So we introduced a process that we assume to be 70% effective in decreasing Neo-Luddite disgruntlement. But what we see is that even though it's having an effect on their overall disgruntlement, the fact that their repertoire is being denied does still cause an overall increase in Neo-Luddite disgruntlement. They are still emplacing more IEDs, although you can see the slope is a more shallow slope. So just something to start with as a point of argument. We need to look at what the impact of emplacing this system of system is going to be. We could also have a model where increased IED shortfall and increased disgruntlement leads them to pursue other violent tactics. But something that we definitely need to explore, because we don't want to end up in a situation where we're escalating the arms race between Neo-Luddites and law enforcement personnel, which is what we may see based on this model if we implement it without any sort of process or without a very effective process to get to the root of their problem. So in summary, the systems dynamics model validates the risk scenarios 2 and 4, with 1 and 3 being outside the scope of the model. And the scenario 2, the do-nothing scenario, is probably not realistic because we're sitting here today, we're talking about policy options. So we probably don't need to worry about scenario 2. Scenario 4, the partial success of the portfolio, may be an acceptable scenario for us. That may be the best we can do, is improve things for society at large, decrease the legitimacy of their argument. We will still have a small group of hardcore Neo-Luddites to contend with. We definitely need more research on the contagiousness of Neo-Luddite violence if the portfolio is implemented and perceived as the government rewarding terrorism or violent tactics. And implementation of the counter-IED system of systems, the effect of that on Neo-Luddite behavior definitely needs more research before we employ this thing. And what I believe is that the timing of the implementation of the policies and the system of systems is going to be critical. It needs to be researched and thoroughly planned in what order we implement these various measures. And final recommendations. Again, if you'll remember from the first slide, bottom line up front, first we've got to start by probing the Neo-Luddite organization, find out how we begin to interact with them, how we begin to deal with them. We need to research the likelihood that any pro-Neo-Luddite policies and programs we implement or any social redress we undertake in this regard is going to be perceived as cooperating with terrorists. And how do we adjust legitimate issues without creating that perception? How do we frame our efforts? Again, need to research the likely neo-Luddite response to the implementation of the system of systems. And then we need to assess the cost of this policy portfolio. What is this going to cost the taxpayer? How feasible are these policies? What's the likelihood of the success of each individual one? And what is the payback in terms of expenditure versus perceived benefit? And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I'll be followed by Mary Benjamin.
I'm not sure how to get to my presentation.
What do you want to do?
Get to my presentation. This is Kim's, so I need to. Okay, thank you. Hello, my name is Mary Benjamin, and I, like Kim, was a former student of Dr. Enge's large-scale systems engineering. And so this is my presentation of my project. As Dr. Enge explained, the purpose and the assignment and the objectives of the assignment. I'll review those. Within the project society, there are neo-Luddites having an aversion to technology, and their radical behaviors is they're championing for the cause. But the project is suffering from this extreme actions, so the collective society is suffering from collateral damage. Forces are needed to manage and control a long-term solution for this volatile society. So our objectives are to explore solutions using system dynamics and other modeling tools and techniques, and to propose a policy portfolio. The effectiveness of the solution will be determined by the improvement on the 7 quality of life dimensions, including the neo-Luddites, as they are members of the society, and the policies will encompass the 6 policy categories. So that's a summary of overview of what Dr. Enge said as the assignment. I'd like to say that my focus for this project was to demonstrate, or my goals, demonstrate the concepts, understand the concepts and the modeling of those tools, and also try to thread or federate the tools through problem solving to solving this problem, and that also to show that there was applicability using these analytical quantitative approach to a society, a social dimension, as opposed to just a purely physical dimension. And then lastly, I think my goal was to also explore some of this problem solutions, give some introspective as to what's causing the volatility of the society and in what forces can improve the situation. As Dr. Enge had an analytical overview, I also presenting my analytical overview of the problem. As you see in the center, this is the social movement theory, the kernel. So that's what I perceive as the society. It has the dynamics are there, and also the problem is to actually force changes in this dynamic function through the policies, regulations, fiscal incentives, enforcement, etc., those 6 categories, with the result being on the other side the improvement in the quality of life dimensions, the 7 quality of life dimensions. Okay, as in with classical systems engineering, you first want to look at the problem space and really identify that problem space, and then you go to the solution space. So in this assignment, or this domain we're working in, we have a problem space where the radical behavior of the neo-Luddites is causing destruction to humans and public properties, and it's such that it needs a forced input into this dynamics to change the dynamics for the betterment of all. So the solution space will be those forces to change these dynamics, and they'll be in the form of the policies to be implemented with the objective to mitigate or reduce adverse impacts of the radical neo-Luddites, and then improve the quality of life parameters. So within this workspace, I'll try to do a federation of these tool sets, these models and concepts, and show that it can be applied to a social domain. So again, my emphasis is on the actual approach, and then give some introspective into the policies. And again, in the time allotted, this is a lot of brainstorming on my part as far as the solutions. But I wanted to show the model that could be used. Okay, so this is just a flow of the approach I'm using. Again, we have the problem space, and in that problem space, to come up with a solution in classical systems engineering, you need to really understand the problem. So there's a lot of focus in this area to understand the dynamics of this society, what's causing the volatility, and why is it so off balance. Also using the reverse reductionism approach with the intelligent agents. I'll define what the society is composed of in the parts and look at the parts and their interactions to again further explore the dynamics of the society. Again, system dynamics will be used with the kernel being the social movement theory. And also with the classical systems engineering, you need to define what do you want to call success. So I'll try to come up with the measures of effectiveness as we go into the solution space. So in the solution space, we're going to be designing a solution. Again, this is classical systems engineering stage 2. We'll again use the risk analysis concepts, what-if scenarios, and try to determine the best solution for the problem, and to see that we're meeting the measures of effectiveness that we've defined earlier in the problem space. And then we'll use some game theory and decision analysis to determine the feasibility of the solution, and then optimize our policy that we've selected, the portfolio. And as with classical systems engineering, you go back to the verification and validation. And lastly, I'll summarize some results or conclusions and follow-on studies needed. Okay, so as we begin, we're looking into the problem space. In this area, I use the classical systems engineering, the agent-based modeling and simulation concepts, system dynamics, and the social movement theory. So what I wanted to know, our solution will be improvement in the quality of life parameters. So we wanted to see what would be the measures of effectiveness, or what's our key performance parameters, or what would we declare victory or success. So I wanted to identify parameters that we would say we had success in our solutions. So I went through each of the quality of life parameters and gave a primary MOE and a secondary MOE. For example, in human health, measure of effectiveness would be the decline in the death rate due to these bombings or these radical actions of the neo-Luddites. The secondary would be decline in the injuries, amputations, stress disorders, etc. So from there, I've defined what my success is. Okay, now using the reverse reductionism approach, I want to actually see what's in the society, what's the components of the society, and understand how they interact. And then, so I have defined this society as having these intelligent agents, and they exchange commodities between each other. For example, the neo-Luddites, that's the general population of the neo-Luddites. There's the neo-Luddite leaders that have a little bit more force and that can kind of control the actions of the neo-Luddites. There's the closed thinkers, which don't have opinion. They go day-to-day life. They just not open to moving from one side to the other. We have the open thinkers who can be influenced by the radical actions or by the government controlling the actions away from the radicals. We have the government, and we have the government enforcers. So those are what I define as intelligence agents of this society. And from that, I went and did a kind of an interface or commodities exchange matrix. And for example, the neolite leaders, their interactions with the neolitites, their interactions with the neolitite leaders would be that they obey and trust and they follow the leaders. So in doing this approach, I wanted to understand the commodities in exchange and better define the society. I did a little different from Kim. I used the system dynamics as to be part of understanding the society dynamics as opposed to validation of the dynamics. So I did do a causal loop diagram using the social theory, the framing process, opportunities and constraints, and the resource mobilization. And I just came up with some dynamics between those three parameters or three components and their interactions. And this was all for the purpose of understanding the problem in which we're trying now to get to the solution. Okay, so now going to the solution space. I used risk analysis, system dynamics, intelligent agent concepts, game theory, and decision analysis in the solution space. So again, I was trying to thread or federate the tools in which Dr. Inji had presented during the course. So in the design solution, I had 3 steps. Step 1 was to look at the consequences for each quality of life measured against the MOEs that I had defined earlier. For example, if the policy did not meet the MOE, what would be the consequence? And the reason I took this approach was to see which factor had the most bang for the buck, or where I should focus the policies to be enforced. And I'll show you the results of each of these following slides. In the step 2, what I took from the consequences that helped to define which are the quality of life parameter I wanted to focus on, I developed scenarios of what if, and using those regulatories or those categories to actually develop scenarios as I tried to formulate a solution, driving policies, and then the portfolio of the policies. And then step 3 was the policy portfolio development, and then I passed this to the test phase. So this is just a flow diagram of my approach. And I apologize, there's not a lot of text here, but these are the results, and I'll try to explain as I go through each result table. The one on the left is the results from the step 1. So I took the consequence. Again, this step was to see which consequence, if it failed the MOE, and rank them to see what consequence or what quality of life parameter I should focus on in developing the policy portfolios. So consequence 1 and consequence 3 were ranked the highest. And if I could, consequence 1 had to deal with human health, and consequence 3 had to do with human rights. And so, for example, for the human health, if we did not meet the reducing the death rate, what would be the consequence for that? And from now, I have the focus of the quality of life parameters to work on the policy portfolio. I went and developed scenarios for each of those. So for consequence 1, I went and developed a scenario for the first policy category and created a scenario, and so on until I had all. Consequence 3 had these 6 categories or policy categories scenarios developed. And then I rated those scenarios with the consequence and put them in a risk matrix to show which one had the most likely to be implemented. So from this, I see that scenario 3 and scenario 4 are the ones that we should develop policy portfolios as they were the most likely to be successful implementation. Okay, so I go on to step 3 of my solution space, and I develop the portfolio policies. And as I was developing the scenarios, I actually saw what other policy categories were linked to it. For example, for the human health scenario 1, I looked at regulations, and if we were to reduce the opportunity of covert placement of bombs by implementing a 9 p.m. curfew, this also needs enforcements. So I was trying to link some other policy categories to that driving policy to later develop the portfolio policies. And so these are my solutions. Portfolio 1 is the government-funded programs will develop new school curriculum that educates and promotes cultural diversity. The government generates pamphlets, will be developed to provide outreach and advertise to promote movement or stimulation for areas that have become economically stagnant and depressed. So fiscal incentives are needed. And going on to policy 2, the government will provide subsidies to the private sector to motivate and develop the technologies that are affordable and have potential benefits. Regulations will be in place to oversee and ensure there are no adverse consequences to public safety or the environment. So, okay, so I have now developed 2 policy portfolios, and now I'm into my system and test, verify, and validate the approach. So now I go back to the intelligent agent parameters, and I examine each of those policy portfolios and have them rated as the positive impacts for each of the agents in the society. And then I've set up a game reward matrix just to see if we have the prisoner's dilemma, which is what we would not like to have, as you saw in Dr. Engi's class. It's not stable. And then we go to the optimizing the 2 options. So here I have the, again, the agents, intelligent agents I've determined in the society and their ratings as far as improvements in the quality of life parameters. And these were just rated on how they improved each of the agents, and so we have a score here. So policy portfolio has a score 103, and 2 is 125. I'm not sure what happened here, but this is a decision tree, and it shows you that policy 2 has the better, will provide the better results. Okay, so in summary, the analysis has shown that the recommended policy portfolio is portfolio 2. All 6 of the quality of life dimensions have the potential for improvement. No single agent class is discriminated. The portfolio has a high likelihood for successful implementation, and the policies suggested are not oppressive. Again, as Dr. Engi had said, what Confucius' parable is nothing worse than oppressive government. And I think that was shown that in the development of the policy portfolio, it was more on the education and not on the government enforcement, the regulatory policies, as they do have adverse impacts, or could have adverse impacts. So the recommendations is more analysis is required to mature the model. I'm talking about the system dynamic model, the society. Stakeholder feedback is required to validate and derive conclusions during the solution discovery process. Again, this was not based on any empirical data. It was more of a surveys or my opinions or brainstorming. Mathematical modeling and simulation concepts can be applied to social situations. However, the human domain space is complex, intelligent, adaptive, and exhibits emergent behavior. So mature models need to be developed for specific situations. A modeling simulation is an iterative process, so further refinement is always recommended, and the human domain space is wicked, so beware of unintended consequences.
Thanks. Thanks to you and Kim. Appreciate it. Well, with that, I hope that was helpful to everyone. In my judgment, these two students have successfully woven together the systems engineering, classical systems engineering construct that we went over in the first segment of this class with this very complex system characterized by social movement theory. Clearly, it's complex, it's intelligent, it's adaptive, it's wicked. System of system concepts are embedded in it. They have clearly shown how to use reverse reductionism in coming up with good solutions to the problem. They've also woven together these different modeling tools ranging from system of systems analytic tool sets through risk, decision theory, game theory, and so on. And federated those models well. So this should give you a good sense, a good flavor for what the class project is all about. And I feel very fortunate we've had these two students to come share with us their work, and I really strongly encourage you to take very seriously the way they've approached this in your work. So with that, thank you for your time, and I've enjoyed this class very much.